Okay, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the introduction. So today I'll talk about statistical methods for solar flare prediction. Just giving you one example of how we're using AI-based methods for some scientific problems. So this is joint work with a bunch of people from statistics and mainly in climate science and space science departments. So I'll give an introduction about what is solar flare events and why we care about it and what kind of data we actually have. And then I'll point out the data analytic challenges that were faced within this particular application domain, because for every single domain, you have your own data analytic challenges in terms of volume of data or maybe sample selection problems. And then I'll talk a few examples of how we are trying to tackle every aspect, not every aspect, selected a few aspects about the data analytic challenges using modern statistical or machine learning methods. And I'll conclude with some future work. So the kind of thing that we're interested in studying is called space weather. It is quite different from the commonly known weather, like rain or snow, or just like a really dark gray day. Space weather come in the form of radio blackouts, solar radiation storms, or geomagnetic storms caused by disturbances from the sun. So the entire Earth system that we're living at is under the subject of the impact from the sun. So on this left-hand side, I'm showing a figure of all of the potential space weather events that has been shown to be impacting the Earth. So again, this is like a big ball here is the sun, and this tiny little thing here is the Earth that we are living in. So there's a bunch of events that might be happening on the solar surface. Some of them is called solar flare events. That's something that we're interested in. And there's also other stuff called coronal mass ejections or solar energetic particles. So all of these events might cause disturbances to the geomagnetic field within the surrounding area of the Earth. And this will cause a lot of issues to our society. So that's why in real time, we always want to monitor and forecast space weather events and trying to evaluate the impacts for the Earth. So essentially, a solar flare event is a very intense localized eruption of electromagnetic radiation in the sun's atmosphere. So essentially, I'm zooming in into one of the regions in the sun. So there's a very bright patch in the middle, and then all of a sudden energy built up, and then it erupted. And this is a particular solar flare event. So it's very localized, and then we put them, we try to number them and crop it out, and we call them active regions. So on the entire disk of this solar surface, there are multiple active patches that's called active regions that is related to solar flare events. And this is the subject of our study in here. So I just want to give a few examples of some famous strong solar flare events that happened in the past 20 years, because these kind of events are not rare, and it's actually impacting our society. Back in 2003, there's a very famous, super strong solar flare event called the Haunting Halloween Storms. It happened at the end of October, just around Halloween time during that year. And then this particular event resulted in a sequence of very strong solar flare events and some coronal mass ejections. And during these storms, a lot of the aircrafts have to be rerouted, and it also affected a lot of the satellite systems and caused the power outage in Sweden. And also a lot of parts in the US is actually impacted. And then there's another event called the X-ray solar flare for Christmas in 2006. And this is a super powerful X-class flare. That's the strongest solar flare event class that we have on record in the history. And actually disrupted the satellite to ground communications and the global positioning systems because of this solar flare event. And then more near more close to us, there was a very expensive solar storm that happened in 2022. That was really last year in February around this time. SpaceX witnessed the direct disruptive power of the sun when the geomagnetic storm destroyed really up to 40 Starlink satellites, which resulted in loss in terms of $1 million. like $50 million. And more recently, something that's relevant but not directly solar flare events also resulted from the solar activities called solar storms. So what just a few days ago, I think, actually in March 2023, just a few days ago, there was a very strong solar activity that resulted in beautiful aurora that people were observing in Europe. And actually, you can also see those as far south as in New Mexico or Arizona area, seeing all kinds of this kind of space weather events. So in terms of societal impacts, it will impact the electrical power grid, radio communications, satellite communication systems, and also sometimes it impacts the power grid, GPS, and there's some indirect impacts on the climate. So that's why we want to focus it. So from a statistician's perspective, in order to answer a scientific question, we always ask the question of what kind of observations is available to us and what kind of information can we extract from these observations to make our inferences. So the first observation that we get is called the Gauss time series or Gauss X-ray flux data. This is essentially a time series of the flare events or the flare intensity levels that's recorded in real time. So I'm displaying some data that was actually happened that was recorded during the time of my when I was preparing for this set of slides. So that was in March 31st, 2023. What we're observing is that in real time, they are taking the records every 1 minute. What is the level of the flare X-ray flux intensity? And then the flare levels are defined based on this X-ray flux intensity. Whenever the X-ray flux intensity exceeds a certain threshold level, we define it as a solar flare event. So in this particular plot, you can see that at the end of March, there was some strong flare events happening around the M class. And then also at the end of the March, there's another C class flare event happening around that time. So this is the data that we have. It is of 1 minute time resolution. And actually we have this data in the past 20, 30 years, which is every minute you have these kind of observations. So this is a big time series of data. And you can see there's a lot of temporal dependency. And this is the subject of our study and the quantities that we actually want to monitor and predict in real time, and maybe 24 hours ahead of time, so that in case there's an event going on, we have enough time to take preparations. So what the other sort of information that's available for us to predict those kind of outcomes, or in a machine learning language, what are the predictors that we can get? So we can collect a lot of the 2D photospheric maps of 3 orthogonal magnetic field components of the sun. So we can directly make measurements of the sun directly. And then the impact will travel to the Earth and then will finally give us potential impacts. So these kind of images are collected also in real time with the very, very high temporal and spatial resolutions. So we can monitor in real time all of those solar images and then try to use those information to decide whether a flare is coming or not. And then over the past many years, again, the world builds on physics. Physics is trying to explain everything. So there's a lot of physics quantities that people have calculated based on these images that are directly related to the mechanism of solar flare eruptions. So these are important features for us to learn from. And then from a machine learning perspective, we have different sets of features around. We have the raw observations that are very high volume, high resolution images, but we also have some processed information that are based on known physics. And then we want to take advantage of all of these information to make accurate predictions of the phenomenon that we're interested in. And then one of the data analytic challenges in terms of solar flare predictions is in terms of the heterogeneity of the solar activities across the different years. So the solar activity comes in solar cycles, every 11 years, you have a solar cycle. So right now I'm showing here the solar activities based on sunspot numbers, which is a strong indicator of how active the sun is across the many years. So there are some very weak activities going on. For example, in 1985, 1986, that was the solar minimum. And then in 1990 and also 2003, the famous Halloween solar storm was the solar maximum. So those are the time points where the sun is super active. And then before 2020, scientists, especially NASA, was predicting our upcoming solar cycle to be a super quiet one, just as the one that we experienced before. So the blue one is actually the predicted solar activity level. But then at the beginning of year 2020 and 2023, we observed many very strong solar storms, especially in March 2023. We experienced 2-3 major solar flare events. So we're observing that actually the Earth is getting more active than predicted, and we're welcoming another era, another age of very strong solar activities. And accurately trying to monitor and forecasting them is really important, especially around the year of 2025, which is projected to be the solar maximum. So another data analytic challenge that we have is that actually those active regions, we have very high spatial and temporal resolution of it. If you zoom into each of those active regions, as I'm displaying here, we have multiple channels of high resolution images that are containing different aspects of the information about the sun. So it's important to integrate them and also make full use of them. But the dimensionality of the data that we have is huge, it's massive. And then the third thing is that solar flare events is not like a cough that a kid has. It happens every month. It's not like that. So strong solar flare events that are going to impact our Earth doesn't really happen a lot. So I'm showing here in year 2011 for February itself, a lot of the solar flares that we observe are actually very weak flare events. Those flare events are not as interesting to us because the sun can keep flaring, but if it doesn't impact us, who cares? But then the things that we're interested in are actually the red dots and especially the purple ones. It happens very rarely. Those are very extreme, very strong, but rare events. So we're actually targeted at predicting those kind of events. So that's another data analytic challenge that we are faced with. So overall, a lot of our work in this solar flare prediction task is focused on, first of all, feature engineering. How can we extract important features from the big dimensional solar images based on physics, machine learning, or statistics, black box, white box methods combined to make the best predictions? And the second, we are interested in solar flare classification and prediction. In real time, how can we tell when the next strong flare is coming? And we're interested in modeling high dimensional images, trying to do dimension reduction, pre-model fitting and within model fitting, do a joint modeling. And also we're interested in building principled interpretable statistical methods to combine multiple sources of information such that we make the best prediction models. And then finally, we're interested in operational forecasting. So this is completely different from any of the machine learning tasks before that I mentioned here in the previous bullet points, because there are so many other issues related to operational forecasting. How can you measure the risk of taking actions in an operational setting? How do you communicate your uncertainties to those space weather forecasters? How can you convince to NASA that a machine learning based or black box based method is as reliable as a physics-based modeling, because the entire society is just occupied by physics modelers. And finally, you have to make sure that your model can be updated in real time according to the solar activities. So a lot of work are actually focused on that. I'll introduce a small fraction of them. So the first thing that we do is feature extraction. So we have a complete black box based feature extraction. So we can do autoencoder to compress a higher dimensional image into a lower dimensional lower dimensional feature space. So here I'm just showing a few of the examples of image reconstruction using autoencoder. I'm not going to go into the details of autoencoder because there are so many tutorials online that you can learn. So on the top of each of those panels, these are the observed magnetic field information, three-dimensional magnetic field information of an active region. And then on the bottom of each part is the reconstructed images based on the lower dimensional feature space that we extracted by training this neural network. So you can see that the reconstruction is actually pretty good, letting us think that the dimension reduction is actually pretty effective in terms of extracting the important features. And we actually put this into a final prediction model and found that actually the performance of these set of features are similar to those already known physics predictors. And those predictors is only of 12 dimensions, whereas here using autoencoder, we have 512 dimensions as the input feature. So completely black box based method essentially give us a proof of concept. There's some information in the images, but we're not doing that efficiently yet. Then we look into some other type of feature construction after talking a lot to those scientists, or especially the physicists who understand the flaring mechanisms. And then we come up with a few more features based on the topology, geometry, and also spatial information. So we borrowed a few concepts from the field of spatial statistics in the statistical literature and try to build important features. And what we can actually show is that using those combined knowledge of topology, geometry, and the spatial separation information within those higher dimensional images, we can actually improve the prediction performance by quite a bit as compared to the vanilla physics-based parameters. So this shows some success after digging into the data and trying to query the different aspects about those images, combining the information from physics, from machine learning, and from statistics. So this is one success in terms of feature engineering that we had. And here I just want to show like a pilot result of some of the visualizations that we have. So the B means a very weak flare event. We don't really care, so it's the baseline. And the M is a very strong flare event that will definitely impact the Earth. So we can see that based on this functional estimate, that's called Ripley's case function, is from spatial statistics. The B flares look very, very different from the M class flare. This is 1 hour ahead of the eruption, 6 hours ahead of the eruption, 12 and 24 hours ahead of the flare eruption. So these features are highly important in terms of separating or distinguishing the very strong flares from the weak flare events. So I'll show a few case studies that we have. So this is the prediction score plotted against the flare event. For each of those channels, they represent 4 different active regions. And then the red marks are the strong flare event. Again, M class, very strong. And then we can show that the prediction score, that means the probability of an upcoming strong solar flare event, actually go from almost 0 to almost 1, around 20 to 24 hours, or maybe sometimes even 40 hours before the strong eruption. So this feature essentially tells us that there's a very strong precursor of strong solar flare events around a day or two before the solar flare events. So that means long-term forecasting for solar flare events is really possible. As I mentioned before, the entire field was actually based on physics models, and the current model that NASA is actually running can only do like a 30-minute prediction using physics simulations, like the numerical solutions for differential equations. But then there are some actually not so good results at the decaying phase of an active region when we track each of the active regions for a longer time horizon. It's nice that the prediction score goes up before the first strong flare event. And we want to expect that the prediction score go down all the way to 0 after the last strong flare event, which is nice. But then there are some regions where we're actually misclassifying. And those are pretty serious mistakes because essentially we're telling people it's going to be super clear, nice, you can send an astronaut to the sky, but then the astronaut will be killed because of solar eruption. So this is not even tolerable in this community. So that means we're making a very serious mistake here by not being able to capture this last strong flare event. So that intrigued us to pursue further into the solar flare classification, solar flare prediction problem, because we're not there yet. And then we proposed this new model, combining the idea of finite mixture models from statistics and also another neural network model. So it's a combination of a highly interpretable model versus another black box model. So this is kind of mixed LSTM regression model for flare intensity prediction. So instead of flare classification, we're focused on flare intensity predictions. And beyond the flaring time, we're also looking at the non-flaring time. That's the quiet time in the data as a baseline. And the byproduct is that we also have a flare classification model. So in this, well, actually it's not showing properly. So we're essentially balancing the two different loss functions for the indicator of whether it's flaring or not, versus a squared error loss for the flare intensity on the log scale. So by defining this loss function and cross-validating on the weight function, we're able to come up with a prediction that's actually looking pretty good. A lot of the slides is not showing up properly because I had a PDF version which is converted to the PPT format. But here I just want to show a few case studies. Again, we want to track 4 different active regions in these 4 different panels. And for each of those active regions, I have 2 plots. The top plot is showing what is the probability of locally there is a flare event. And on the bottom, I'm labeling the flare events, the weaker ones with the green color, and the red ones labeling the really strong flare events. So we can see that whenever there's flare events happening, my probability scores are always very high. So that means the first piece of the model is actually doing a good job. And then on the bottom of each of those active regions, I'm showing what is the local maximum peak intensity of this particular active region for the flare event. So essentially it should be tracking the local maximum of each of those flare regions. So you can see that it's actually tracking the red dots or the local maximum pretty well in each of those active regions. So that means this model is being pretty successful in terms of capturing both the solar activity in general, what is the probability of erupting, but also the erupting magnitude, that's the flare intensity. So that's the that's the other thing about using statistical models and the black box machine learning models and taking advantage of both at the same time. That you have interpretability, you can incorporate some knowledge that you already have from the domain, but you also want to leverage the power of AI in general in the model building. And then finally, we also want to do the data analysis with the raw data instead of the processed data. Again, we want to go back to the multi-channel high dimensional images itself and want to model it in the raw format. So we proposed this model called Tensor Gaussian process with contraction regression model. And this paper was recently submitted to ICML response to one of the questions raised. We were experiencing those ad hoc reviews recently about this conference papers, but we got pretty good ratings, so I don't really have much complaint about it, but it's pretty ad hoc because their comments are really interesting to read. So we were representing this multi-channel image with a 3-mode tensor. Remember that we were having those high-dimensional images as our predictors. So these are all of our predictors. And we're representing these images in a 3-mode tensor. So the first 2 dimensions are the image dimensions representing the horizontal and the vertical coordinates. And then the third mode is representing each of those channels. Those include the magnetic field information, but also the temperature map information. So that's how we're representing our raw data. It's a very high dimensional thing that we're currently having. In the current work that we have, H is equal to 200, W is equal to 200, and C is equal to 12. So it's a very high dimensional tensor that we're looking at. And then we're combining two different kinds of models from statistics in order to handle this high dimensional data in an efficient fashion. So the first aspect is called a tensor contraction. We're trying to multiply a sparse latent, we're trying to obtain a latent factor that's explaining the efficient information in the data by compressing on each of those high dimensions and compressing the large dimensional tensor into a smaller dimensional tensor. So that's the contraction stage, and this is data-driven. And then at the second step, we're doing a tensor regression because again, we don't want to sacrifice the nonlinear relationship identification. We want to leverage the effect, the power of a Gaussian process modeling to do the prediction. And we're working on a joint model with these two aspects. Our loss function is based on these two different aspects. We're using a total variation penalization term to regularize our model such that we get sparse solutions. Those are standard machine learning techniques that I'm not going to introduce into details. So I'm going to again demonstrate some numerical results. So here is the channel average tensor of a B-class solar flare event. That's the weaker flare event that looks like this. And then for a stronger solar flare event, that looks like this. So you can see that on the raw data scale, it looks very different from each other. And then in terms of our tensor contraction, fitted parameter for the coefficients, what we're capturing are actually those banded information that I'm plotting here. Essentially, they're trying to capture, first of all, the overall brightness of that particular image, but also some localized contrasting information of those images. And those comply with the physics knowledge that there's actually something called a polarity inversion line that's really important for solar flare eruptions. So the machine learning algorithm finally, based on these images that we are looking at, these again is capturing the important region that the machine identified itself in an automated fashion. What are the regions of interest and what are the contrasting features it has constructed for itself to distinguish the stronger ones from the weaker ones. And then these are the other coefficient matrices, which I'm not going to go through in details. Okay, the formulas are messed up. So another interpretation that I also want to show, because the variance formulas are essentially messed up, is through this particular model that we're actually fitting, we're able to disentangle the relationship across the different channels of images that we have. Because one outstanding question among the physics community for solar flare eruption is that what kind of complementary information does the different channels of the images are providing? Are they providing redundant information, similar information, or orthogonal information? So through the covariance matrix interpretation and the modeling, essentially it's called the analysis of variance in statistics. If you have learned stats 100, you probably know that already. So through a decomposition of the variance, we're able to show that the different channels of the magnetic field are providing similar information, whereas the temperature map can produce external information that part of them is explained by the magnetic field already, but part of them is not even explained by the magnetic field. So that is really important to use both pieces of information to do flare forecasting. And of course, in terms of interpretable machine learning, we can also give a ranking of the importance in terms of how much percentage of the variance explained by each of those features. And we can show that this thing called the polarity inversion line, which is the first thing here, is explaining the largest percentage of the variation in the data. So this complies with the physics knowledge that this inversion line is really the most important part in this flare prediction. So here I just want to briefly discuss our ongoing and future work along this direction and leave the rest of the time for Q&A if you're interested. So we are able to work on innovative integrative analysis with both the magnetic field information and the temperature map data directly from the sun, and trying to track in real time, and then and then to predict those future solar eruptions. And we want to have physically meaningful features derived. And actually, our collaborator from the space science department has been actively looking into all of the cases that we identify as very special, and then do the case studies and trying to study the physics, all of those eruptions that we identify. So those has been really interesting and it's ongoing work. And finally, we want to build a principled and reliable, and most important of all, reproducible statistical inference driven by physics principles with proper uncertainty quantification. This is not a trivial job in that community because, again, we're dealing with rare events. Different people are training, splitting, training validation and testing with different sample splits, and that creates a lot of trouble in terms of applying them in real time. And uncertainty quantification is not even enabled in many of the analyses. So here is a list of the papers that we published in our group. And then right now we're looking for interested students to join us. If you are interested in some of the work that I'm mentioning or some future directions, feel free to contact me or talk with me during my office hours. And I'll save the rest of the time for Q&A.
Thank you, Yang Chen. I think we have time for one quick question. Yeah. And I apologize for the equations. I downloaded the wrong set of slides.